Did you know that in Lightroom we have 4 different ways to add saturation to our photos, and they don't all produce the same results because that's just Lightroom. Oh, and by the way, I'm not even talking about vibrance. Vibrance is the 5th one, but we're just gonna touch on that later on. But first, hi, my name is Vlad, I'm a portrait photographer, and over the last few years I spent a lot of time developing tools and presets so I won't have to go to Photoshop every time I want to do something a bit more serious to my photos. And that's exactly how this channel was born. So if you enjoy advanced Lightroom tutorials, maybe hit the subscribe button, and now let's talk about saturation. And for today's example, we're using this simple portrait of me in a park holding up a color target. And I think this is super important because, as you're gonna see later, this will show up how different sliders affect colors in different ways. What I've done to the photo are some basic adjustment, giving it a bit more dynamic range and lowering the contrast because I shot this one in broad daylight. And the first way to apply saturation is the most obvious one, the saturation slider right here in the basic panel of Lightroom. And what I'm gonna do here is apply 50 saturation. It's way too much for this photo, but the goal is to make it easier for us to see the differences. And now let's go over here on the left side and create a new snapshot, call it saturation 1. And you're gonna see in a moment why I need 2 of them. And now let's reset the saturation slider, and instead of adding 50 saturation in the basic panel, let's do it in a mask. I'm gonna use a select all mask, as I like to call it. It's basically just a linear gradient where I click outside of the photo and drag it outwards. It looks like this, and what it allows me to do is apply all the settings in a mask on the entire photo. And now let's add 50 saturation over here as well. And probably some of you already noticed that the photo that's resulting is not that saturation. But let's create another snapshot, call it saturation 2. And I'm also going to mention that this is a mask. And now let's compare them. You can see how much more saturated the one where we use the saturation slider in the basics panel is compared to the one where we use the mask. But my guess here is that Lightroom is doing this thing where it's applying the settings from a mask at the end of the processing chain, while the settings in the basic panel are applied first and then some more things come on top. So that's a more powerful slider. But that's just a guess, and we have 2 more ways to add saturation. And to do that, I'm gonna go ahead and delete the mask that I just created, and instead of adding saturation using a saturation slider, I'm gonna use all the saturation sliders in the HSL or color mixer. And you would think that if I add 50 saturation to all of my channels, I would get 50 saturation across the entire photo. But let's take a snapshot, call it HSL, and now let's compare this photo that we have right now with the one where I added saturation using the saturation slider. And you can see there are quite a lot of differences, and the one with the saturation slider is much more saturated. And if you think that I'm going a bit fast right now, that's because I want to get through all of them, and then we're going to compare them at a much slower pace. Now let's add saturation using the calibration panel. So I'm going to be resetting the HSL, and I'm going to be adding 50 saturation to all of my 3 primary channels, and you might think that, well, this is adding 50 saturation across the entire photo. So let's take one more snapshot. I'm gonna call it calibration, and now let's compare. Compared to the basic saturation slider, there's a difference in luminosity, and compared to the mask method and the HSL method, both of those are way less saturated than what we're getting from the calibration panel. And it would be a shame if we didn't include the vibrance on that list, so I went to Lightroom, set my vibrance over here to 50 and took one more snapshot. But the thing with vibrance is that I already expected it to behave differently than all of our other methods, because vibrance, according to Adobe, is trying to boost the less saturated tones in my photos while preventing skin tones from getting oversaturated. And you can even see this in action if I zoom in on my color checker. Keep an eye on this third row over here and on the blues and the greens in the bottom part. And I'm going to slowly increase the vibrance, and you can see how the blue checkboxes are changing a lot while the skin tones are barely changing color, gaining just a little bit of saturation when I push my vibrance slider up to 100. And there's one more thing. I'm gonna reset the vibrance slider, and you'll keep an eye on these two squares right here. And when I'm pushing the vibrance slider, you can see how the bottom one becomes way more saturated because that bottom square is less saturated in the beginning. And this really shows that vibrance is really adding a lot more saturation to the less saturated areas of our photo. So if you wanna even them out, we can use this to our advantage. And this works both ways because I can boost the saturation and everything gets more saturated, but if I reduce the vibrance, the super saturated parts in the photo get less saturated. And that's a tip that we can use to get a bit more color density throughout our entire photo. And finally, let's compare all the four saturation methods because while in the beginning you could be thinking that I was just adding 50 saturation to my photo with any of them, the results are pretty different and you can see them cycling on the screen right now. And the first thing that stands out to me is that the usual saturation slider does this thing to my shirt where the highlights get super saturated. And that's in part because I actually clipped this photo. If I go back in Lightroom and pull back the highlights recovery that I did, you can see this red spike on the histogram that's basically telling me that hey, your photo has some clipping in it, but you haven't clipped all your channels, you only clipped the red one. But at the same time, the thing with the usual saturation slider is that it's saturating all the colors equally. No matter how saturated, how bright or dark they are, all the numbers get brought up in an equal manner, and that can easily lead to oversaturation if you're not paying attention. And from all these comparisons, I figured that the saturation slider in the base adjustments panel is one of the most powerful ways to add saturation to your photos. But also the calibration panel is a pretty strong contender. Yet at the same time, if we jump from one to another, we can observe that they affect color in different ways. And I even suspect that adding saturation with the calibration panel can actually shift your hues around. I mean, take a look at these two green squares right here, and you can notice that they are getting closer together when I'm using the photo with the calibration panel saturation boost. And at the other end of the spectrum are the HSL and the saturation mask, which produced pretty similar results in the sense that both of them were pretty dull looking. And when I say dull looking, I mean compared to the saturation slider or the calibration panel, because they actually did add a lot of saturation to my image, but the change was more incremental. And I also noticed a pretty weird thing happening just as I was editing this video. When we're comparing the base image right here with the HSL method or the saturation mask, they are not affecting the yellow square right here. And the other ones are getting really saturated, especially the blue ones. So I have no idea what's going on there. It's adding saturation, obviously more into the bluish tones, but maybe they act in a similar way that the vibrance slider did. And that actually tracks well because if I add the vibrance photo into the mix, you can see that they all look pretty similar, with the HSL being just a bit warmer on the skin tones over here when comparing it to the saturation mask, but overall they are all pretty close together, no major changes whatsoever. So, while I'd love to say that the conclusion of this video is that I discovered that Adobe lied to us and a mask with 50 saturation on top of your photo is pretty much the equivalent of boosting your vibrance to 50, that's probably not the case because masks come pretty late in the processing pipeline while the vibrance slider is pretty much in the beginning of our edits. Also, I would love to have a proper conclusion, but what I can say for sure right now is that the four main ways that you can add saturation to your photos work pretty differently. Calibration and the basic saturation slider are gonna be pretty harsh, and we probably should use them just in the first stages of our edits so we can do rough adjustment, while we can use HSL and masking to do localized stuff and push our colors around. So I wouldn't recommend you to use the HSL as a block and move all the sliders at the same time, because you're basically losing control over one of the most powerful tools in Lightroom. Instead, if you like creative photography, I would strongly encourage you to try and play around with the saturation that's coming from the calibration panel, because in my experiments, I was able to get fuller colors and denser tones, especially in the highlights and near the lights, if I'm using the saturation in the calibration panel compared to what I was getting when I was pushing just the basic saturation slider. And also, I plan to play around more with negative vibrance. My idea is that I can saturate the most saturated parts of my photos and then bring the entire photo up with the saturation slider, and this way I'm trying to get a film look in which nothing gets oversaturated. But that's a problem for another day. If you have any type of Lightroom issues or would like a mentoring session, let me know in the comments down below, because that's something that I'm thinking I should start to offer. But anyway, that was the video for today. Thank you for watching. Hit the subscribe and the like button on your way out, and I'll see you in the next video.